So, now we have a session which is very much focused on Africa. We're going to have 4 speakers from different types, different places in the industry. And they are just randomized, so I didn't really put them in any particular order. But starting off the session is has become a good friend of mine, can I say? At least a friend, good friend, yeah. That I like to joke around with in the office when I'm there. Joanne Berry from Nordic approach. She's a coffee green buyer. Yeah, you can introduce yourself maybe. But please give a big hand for Joanne.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Jens, and the factory. It's really great to have this opportunity to be here. It's quite strange for me because for some years I watched this event from a distance, soaking up all the bits of information I could online and thinking, oh, what a wonderful thing to one day be there. I'm originally from South Africa, and I initially started working coffee there in a small roastery. So you have no idea when you are able to be in Europe and around many other roasters what an amazing opportunity and resource it is to share knowledge. And when you come from a different background, you really feel the lack of that. So well done for all being here and for those that are contributing, because I think it's very important for our industry. So that's a little bit about my background. I'm South African. I have been in Europe for the last 8 years, working in coffee, probably for around 6. I worked in London for a green importing company for some time, and for the last almost 2 years, I've been working with Nordic Approach. Prior to Nordic Approach, my background was in buying in East Africa, and it's continued to be so, with some extension as we do buying in other parts of the world as well, and I'm starting to get involved in that. So I have to say that the heading for this talk was sourcing green coffee in East Africa, the importer's point of view. I'm taking some big liberties because half an hour for me is not enough time to talk about sourcing green coffee in Africa. You didn't even say East Africa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that was more interesting for me, and I felt would be more interesting for all of you. It's certainly sourcing in Africa, but with a bit of a broader perspective. So when I first thought about talking here, it was a big concern to me to be able to talk about something that was interesting for everybody here. I think all of you are aware of sourcing green coffee. You're quite mature in your understanding of the industry. And so it didn't seem right to rehash some of the information that you're already going to be aware of. And then I started to think about the things that I get to do. I get to travel with a lot of different people from different countries who are buying from different perspectives. And I have a lot of exposure to different people's way of thinking. So for me, it was interesting to explore that more than just buying, but rather how we look at buying as an industry. I think who we are as individuals plays a role in how we look at buying and what platform we sort of base our decision making off of. I am a woman, I am from South Africa, I now live in Oslo. All of those things affect my decision making in my job, in life as well. I think as an industry, it's also really important that we are communicative and we share our knowledge with each other. I think it builds strength into the different parts of our industry and it helps us grow. So I think talking about how we make decisions and why we make them is important. For Africa, for me, it's very important to talk about how we buy because Africa is so unlike a lot of other parts of the world where we buy coffee. So for me, it was very relevant to think about how we decide to buy coffee and how Africa works, and whether the two things are actually working together, and whether we're able to achieve what we're setting out to. based on the way we're doing it and the way Africa's production model currently exists. And it's a bit of a self-indulgent journey that I'm taking you on today, because it's largely something that I have found over the last maybe 3 or 4 years a struggle. Because I came into the coffee industry with a lot of ideas about what I was doing, what my job meant. Of course, I liked coffee, I was interested in the product. I liked working with people, I liked traveling. But there was fundamentally something more that you're able to do by working in the coffee industry, by developing an industry in other parts of the world that sometimes lacks access to resources, to knowledge, to skills. And many of us are able to share that very often in different contexts. But a struggle became, what difference was it really making? Because my misconception was initially that we were making a big difference. And the more I've traveled with different people, the more I found that there is a disconnect between what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it and the reality of what's actually happening, and especially in the context of Africa. And that's why I think it's really important to think about. So through this process and through the process of traveling with a lot of different people, I started to notice that we all have specific points of view that we base our decision making on. And in many cases, it's not one point of view. We are working in a combination. But I thought it would be important to talk about what I've noticed, the people that work with us, how they are buying and what platform they are buying off of. So it's also added a lot of value to me to work with different people and to be exposed to different people's perspectives. It's made me question the way that I work and enriched my experience in coffee. So I think there are 5 different ways of buying that I've acknowledged, or approaches, perspectives that people buy from when they are traveling with us. So I'd say the first is people that are entirely concerned with cup quality. When we're buying, we're only looking at the value of that coffee on the table in front of us. How does it cup? What am I scoring it? How is the profile fitting into my business? How is the profile going to represent me in my market and show people who I am as a business? A lot of people, including myself, often are cupping with that entirety, being the entire goal, seeing what that coffee is, how the coffees are different, where is their value on this table. So I like to call these people the purists, because they're all about the coffee. I think people, when we come to cupping and we come to looking at quality, we observe very strictly as purists. We want the coffee to be the only thing that matters when we're buying. We want it to be free from contamination. The second point of view or perspective that I've seen important to people is relationships. Many people buy with a huge emphasis on the relationship they build with the people that they're buying coffee from. Their primary concern is to know where the coffee comes from and to know the people behind the coffee. I like to see these people as connectors. They are connecting our world with the producing world. Sorry. So they're uniting and binding producers with those of us who are buying and selling and consuming the product. And I think this is an important part. Each of these perspectives are important in the way that we purchase coffee and in building into buying, green buying. The third way that I've noticed people buy, or platform that people buy with in mind, is a social conscience. People want to do something and want to say something more than just about the coffee that they're buying. They want to communicate a concept around their purchasing and around the product that they're buying. For me, these people are like the educators. the correctors. Sorry. Need to take a breath, I think. The nerves are a little running high. So for me, people who are building into relationships are wanting to correct many of the past misjustices in coffee, the way the industry's worked as a commodity, the way it hasn't worked for most people on the producing end of coffee. And it's an important aspect of buying to think about how we're building into relationships, because essentially a lot of the way we buy, a lot of what happens in terms of access to coffees is based on the relationship you have with the people you're buying from. So I think it is very important. I think here we want to build a certain way, and we want to build into longevity of the relationships we have with the people we're working with. The third way I've noticed people make decisions or base their decision making on is marketing. We have to sell and be able to entice our consumers into a product that's still relatively young and people are still learning to understand. So marketing a product and talking about it and being able to communicate about it to customers is a very important process of coffee. We have to help people learn about coffee, about the way we want them to see coffee and the way we want it to be developed. So for me, people who are buying from this perspective are educators. They are developing and understanding, they are informing and training consumers about the product that we are all working in. And they are helping people to connect the product that we're trying to present with what their understanding of what that product should be is. The last way that I've seen people buying from is from a sense of doing business. I like coffee, I want to work in it, but at the end of the day, we have to make money. It sounds pretty cynical, but I actually think this is a very important part of our business. If we're not making money, we're not able to reinvest back into producers and into our buying. And neither are we able to have businesses that help consumers understand what coffee can be. So I call these people, this perspective, builders. They create and strengthen and they forge forward and increase. And I think it's a very important aspect of the way that we buy. So when I've traveled with people, I've seen that everybody comes from one of these kinds of perspectives. For some people, the coffee is the most important thing. That's what they want to see, is the cup quality on the table. For other people, it's about relationships. It's about building community. It's about building into the industry and about expanding an understanding of who the people are behind the coffee and how their lives work. For other people, it's about social conscience. It's about understanding the environment and the context in which coffee is grown and the people whose lives are affected by it. For other people, it's about marketing. We're selling a concept, we're educating consumers. And for some people, it's about business. It's about making money, and it's about making money for ourselves, but also for everybody in the chain that we work with. For me, I think that every one of these aspects or perspectives that we buy from is really important. And I think in most cases, people don't just buy with one of these perspectives. They actually buy with a number of these perspectives in combination. And that's how they build into the decisions that they make. It's a platform on which they decide what coffees they want to buy and they're interested in. I think that no matter which perspective you're coming from and no matter where you think your goal is or your perspective is in buying coffee, I think we all have the same goals. We're all looking to invest our buying in places that both increase quality and increase the quality of life of those producing coffee. So no matter where we come from, no matter what platform we make our decisions on, we all have the same goal. And I think all of these different perspectives are important in maintaining a varied and buying structure with depth and varied. And I think that what's important to understand is that they're all necessary. All of these ways that we think about buying coffee, all of the things that we value when we are in front of the table cupping coffee. So that's what I thought about when I thought about the people that I travel with and what I've seen, how I've seen people make decisions, and what platforms they make decisions from. What's interesting is how that relates to the context in which we are buying coffee. So for me, Africa is a complex place to work. And talking about buying coffee in Africa, it's like a conversation. It's so varied and complex. A conversation depends on who's taking part. It depends on what the topic is. It depends on the context that the conversation is taking place in. It depends on what people are talking about and how they're feeling. And there's never any absolutes. Everything is always fluid and always changing, and it requires a lot of adaptation. So to talk about Africa as a whole is a difficult thing to do because every country is as complex as each other. And I think that it's interesting to think about Africa and the model of production in general and how that works for the way that we are trying to achieve our goals. How are we able to achieve our goals in the context of production in Africa? So I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with production in East Africa. It's, like I said, to me, like a conversation. It's like people talking and trying to understand each other. And it's complex. The model of production in East Africa, for the most part, there are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, production in East Africa is made up of thousands of small producers. Producers who have very little resources and very small amounts of land and producing very small volumes. They are very under-resourced, and it's hard to know how to impact a context like that, where there are so many people involved and so many different parts of the puzzle. So majority of production in East Africa is smallhold farmers. They don't have the resources to present their product singularly most of the time. They don't have access to a market for their product. And in many cases, they don't even have the means to take their product from cherry to full production on their own. So what happens is in most cases that small producers come together and create groups. They can be cooperatives, unions, small farm groups. What that means is that the way that we buy coffee from farmers is that no farm, or it's very rare that you find you're buying a coffee from one farmer directly. You're buying coffee from a number of farmers who have pooled their resources in order to build infrastructure for their selling. So I think that's a very important thing to understand, and how that can limit our ability to have an impact on the quality of production. And it can limit our ability to affect the coffee industry in Africa, because it is so scattered and it's so in fragments in many senses, in terms of actually building into the cherry quality, which is the place we start off with in terms of maintaining or achieving quality in coffee. So yeah, so the reality in Africa as well is that there are so many people involved. There's 9 to 11 million people across Africa involved in coffee. And it accounts for household income for across 7 million households. So the vast expanse of what coffee is across Africa means it's very difficult to work productively and with any kind of meaning into that system. Unlike South America, where you have or Central South America, we have a lot of farmers who even though their infrastructure may be limited, they still have the infrastructure of some kind, where in Africa there's such a lack of infrastructure that it's very difficult for farmers to work singularly in any way, and very difficult for them to access a market for their coffees. When you're pooling your coffee or coming together to create lots, there's a limit to how much your investment in your product, on the quality of your product, can really have an impact on the total production. So when we invest with single farmers in Africa, it's very difficult for that coffee to always be kept at the level of their investment in quality. Coffee in Africa is also very political. Coffee is one of the biggest foreign exchange earners for most African countries, or for many African countries. It's often one of the biggest, or the biggest, agricultural export. So all of the decisions made around coffee are always with a political agenda. And that is something you always have to think about when you start to invest in producers and on the ground, because you have very little control over what decisions will be made politically about coffee that will change the landscape for your investment in a group or a producer. The laws and regulations regarding coffee are made by governments, and often in many cases by governments that don't always understand the coffee industry or the extent of the effect that the decisions they're making can have. The government and the political agenda that decisions are often made from in these countries can often hinder the industry itself and hinder the growth and stability of the coffee industry. So here we see both our perspectives, how we're trying to invest in buying, and how that comes up against a number of different things that are the reality of production in East Africa. Like I said, politically, no matter how much you're investing, the political decisions made can often threaten those investments that you make in producers, and the investments that you hope they will benefit from as well. For example, there are situations even now going on in Kenya where decisions are being proposed that threaten some of the infrastructure that's being put in place by the specialty side of the market, where people and companies invest in assisting farmers to produce better quality, to have more stability, to take back more control over their earning power. And when that happens, you have to adjust as a buyer or an importer to that environment, because you cannot control what decisions are made from a political point of view. So you have to work and learn to work alongside those decisions and with those decisions, and sometimes to argue against them. What's clear is that the way that we are trying to invest in coffee hasn't really given the results that we would like, I would say. I don't think the results are always bad. I think often we're investing in ways that we see benefit for producers and for the quality of the coffee. But I think in many cases, these results are happening very slowly. And I think the reality is that we're not creating a lasting or long enough effect, or the effect that we are intending to. So production trends in East Africa show that there is a large number of producing countries, 25 producing countries across East Africa, which is the largest as opposed to any other continent. yet the production is decreasing. For the last 43 years, it has been decreasing. And although production volume is not always what we are so concerned about when we are looking at the quality of coffee, production volume is really important for most producers because what they're making money from is not just the small amounts of specialty that we buy, but more importantly, it's their whole production. And so I think it's really important as an industry that we also start to take into account how we need to invest in farmers in a way that is meaningful and has effect on their ability to produce quality, but in fact that has to be their whole production. Because farmers have no control over the price that they get paid for their coffee. In most cases, that is dictated by the market. But they can have some effect on the volumes that they're able to produce, which enriches and can increase their income. So I think while we are, and quality is essential in what we do, and we should be pushing for that, I think we need to find new and innovative ways to focus on investing in producers beyond just their best quality coffees, but actually look at how we can affect their income and their ability to produce those best quality coffees by also allowing them to make money off of everything else. And I think that's one of the real challenges is that I've come up against, is that no matter how much we are buying, what price we're paying, it's not enough if producers can't make money off of their total volume of production. I think the problem here is that there's really, currently, the production in Africa is not, the coffee production in Africa is not operating in a sustainable way. What we are trying to achieve through different perspectives is not being reached. And I think to some extent we need to challenge ourselves to look at engaging with the coffee industry in Africa in a new way, in an innovative way. And that's something that I don't have the answer for, but I think as an industry we can come up with community together with more productive ways of engaging with buying in Africa. That's it. Thank you.
So no time for Q&A, because we're going to have a panel discussion at, what time is the panel discussion? Yeah, later in the afternoon, where Joanne, the next speaker, and the two other speakers speaking this afternoon are going to sit on stage so we can fire them up with some nice questions. So, thank you, Joanne.